The Often Forgotten History of Gangs by Nahali Patel and Anjali Mahesh.
Thesis. Gangs are often seen as the root cause of disruption in society. However, when considering the way gang influence fluctuates based on government policy, poverty, and racial prejudice surrounding the time period, it is clear that gangs are actually an effect of disruption in society.
What are gangs and why do people join them? Gangs are basically organized groups of criminals. You may be wondering, well, why would people join these groups if they're considered violent and bad? That's because gangs give their members a sense of protection and unity. The picture on the slide is of the 5-point gang. You can see that the men in the picture are standing closely together, a sign of unity. '1820s, immigration patterns and the Industrial Revolution. It's important to note that 1820 to 1860 was the first wave of immigration, and 1860 to 1920 was the second wave of immigration. Both of these time periods are significant to criminal history in America. We'll first focus on the time surrounding the first wave. Immigrants faced high levels of discrimination from nativists, causing them to be more likely to join a gang. Previously said before, gangs give their members a sense of belonging and protection. From the period 1820 to 1930, 4.5 million Irish people immigrated to America. Irish immigration reached its peak in the 1840s due to a potato famine back home. It's important to note that although America offered the Irish better living conditions, it was not the best. This video emphasizes the impact nativism had on immigrant lives.
The flood of immigrants in the 1840s and 50s inflamed national prejudices. Many Americans feared Irish and German immigrants would outbreed, outvote, and outwork native-born Americans. Anti-immigrant groups quickly formed and began to call themselves nativists.
Nativism is not just simply the irrational hatred of newcomers and fear of foreigners and fear of people who are different. You can actually break nativism down into a series of themes, series of issues that people worry about. One of them is certainly economic. Immigrants represent, in many people's minds, job competition. They are willing to work for less, therefore they'll pull people's wages down.
Nativists also feared the growing political power of immigrants as Irish and German immigrants filled America's cities and earned the right to vote.
They're able to greatly influence and essentially take over the political systems in these cities, including big cities like New York and Boston, Philadelphia. So there's fear that there's literally this immigrant takeover politically taking place.
But more than anything, nativists mistrusted the religious belief that the new immigrants brought with them from Europe.
That's probably the number one consistent concern of nativists, is that these immigrants the majority of them are Catholics. Almost 100% of the Irish that are coming after the 1830s are Catholic immigrants, and about 50% of the Germans that arrive in this time period are Catholics. America has long had an anti-Catholic tradition. Goes back into the colonial period, and this is part of America's heritage. That it was founded largely, very self-consciously, as a Protestant nation. Americans thought of themselves as Protestants and were steeped in the fears and concerns of Protestants about Catholics going back to the Reformation and even before then. They saw the Pope not as a religious figure, they saw him as a player, as a king in Europe who meddled in political affairs, who got involved in wars, who started wars.
Nativists saw the multiplying numbers of Irish and German Catholics as a conspiracy by the Pope to take over the Republic. In America's biggest cities, nativist groups attacked and burned Catholic churches, schools, even orphanages. As these small anti-immigrant groups grew in number, they formed a new political party called the Know Nothing Party.
Well, the Know Nothings is a kind of a nickname that applied to the American Party, and they get the name from the secrecy that surrounded the organization. The rule was, if you were asked about the organization, people said, "What is this group you belong to?" You were ordered to answer, "I know nothing."
The Know Nothings ran candidates for political office in state after state in the Northeast. They vowed to pass restrictive immigration laws, like one that would make immigrants wait 21 years before they could become voting citizens, and another that would prevent anyone who wasn't a native-born American from holding any political office. In 1854, the Know Nothing Party had their largest victory in the country, capturing the governor's office in Massachusetts, the entire state Senate, and the House of Representatives. But once they came into power, the Know Nothings never passed the tough anti-immigration measures that they'd promised, and by ignoring the growing issue of slavery, they became irrelevant to both Northerners and Southerners. Eventually, the Know Nothing Party dissolved, and many of their supporters gravitated to the Republican Party, formed in 1854. The Know Nothings would no longer be a viable party, but as long as immigrants kept arriving in America, anti-immigrant feelings would continue to grow.
As shown in the video, many of the immigrants coming into America settled in urban cities, where it was easier to find unskilled labor. This increased poverty rates and led to more congested housing conditions, such as tenements, passing of disease, and so on. Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts led to mass production. Hiring unskilled workers was much more beneficial to companies because it was cheaper and easier to manage. As job opportunities increased in this field, population and poverty grew significantly. The year 1820 marks the formation of the first gang in America, the 40 Thieves. The 40 Thieves was a New York City street gang made up by Irish immigrants. Their early intentions were to rebel against their low social status. However, this wrath soon changed into a fuel for criminal activity.
A change in the organization of gangs. Organized crime emerged during the 1900s, which was very different to the disordered street gangs earlier. Political bosses ran these organized criminal schemes. These gangs were made of people in that particular political machine. The people helped get their political boss elected, and in return, the new politician would ignore illegal activities and hand out jobs and provisions to the people. 1920s, the Prohibition era, organized crime and political bosses. We've discussed the first types of gangs in America and why they formed. Now we can transition into what they turned into, the final types of gangs. At first, cities lurked with street gangs who protected speakeasies and illegal breweries through violence and bribes. Trafficking and criminal activity grew immensely in response to the prohibition. The picture shown here is one of an illegal speakeasy. The change here was that these street gangs got smarter and hired lawyers, accountants, and even partnered with nearby street gangs. In this image, the crime bosses are consulting with their lawyer. Organized crime was formed through these advancements. The quote-unquote thugs became businessmen. Business opportunities in the alcohol industry led to the formation of pacts among gang leaders across state and international borders. This allowed easy shipment throughout the country.
Charles Lucky Luciano is often referred to as the father of the modern American mafia. Although Luciano brought together New York's Italian and Jewish mobsters, his relations with the North Side Irish and Polish gangs were weak. After Al Capone took over Luciano's position, tensions escalated. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre revealed the true dangers involved with gang activity during the period. American society in the late 1800s and early 1900s was well shaped by government policies and laissez-faire attitudes. The government kept minimal interference in economic affairs, a capitalistic belief. However, this led to the emergence of corruption, monopolies, and unfair business practices. These qualities are evident in the bootlegging business.
Notorious gangsters. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, also known as Scarface, was a huge gangster during the Prohibition era. When he was finally arrested, they convicted him on tax evasion. He was given an 11-year sentence, of which he actually ended up serving only 8 years. He died from a stroke in 1947. John Dillinger was a Great Depression gangster and bank robber. Famously, he escaped from jail multiple times, and after his death in a shootout, the federal agents in Chicago came to identify him by his escort, who became to be known as the Woman in Red. Finally, Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie and Clyde were a crime couple based in Texas in the 1930s. They were outlaws and thieves, and responsible for the death of 9 police officers and several civilians. Gangs in the media. Even though the media wrote about Al Capone, he hated it. He notoriously hated his nickname, Scarface. Further, he despised the things they wrote about him and continuously declined invitations to act in their movies. These next 2 figures were famous in the Great Depression. The media during this time looked on uncertainty filled with uncertainty, looked to these figures for inspiration. They became American heroes, quote unquote, and legends during this period. John Dillinger. He was a famous gangster who the media loved writing about in a very loving way. He famously escaped from prison twice, one time with a bar of soap he had carved to look like a gun. Some people saw him as a Robin Hood, whose crime hurt the institutions that failed the people. During this period, the media romanticized Bonnie and Clyde. They were even denoted the most popular and famous criminals in American history. This was because the newspapers knew that the people reading about the miserable economy during this period did not want to read the paper anymore. And in an effort to bring people back to their newspapers, they started writing interesting stories about these thieving characters.
The public was fascinated by Bonnie and Clyde. This video explains how the Great Depression bred criminal activity.
This ain't living.
Bonnie and Clyde saga was important at the time because of how important the Depression was and how important the interaction of the Depression, which was a horrible time in a very poor part of our country.
I think the Depression era itself started a crime wave because people were starving and they didn't know what else to do. And the Barrow family, they lacked education. Buck and Clyde started stealing chickens. Before banks, it was chickens and turkeys.
I got it! Hey! Come on, Marvin!
Because it was survival, first and foremost.
They were so poor and so disenfranchised and not educated past a certain point. We can't even fathom the level of poverty that we were in that time.
I had this romanticized idea of them in my head, and I didn't realize how hard their life on the road would have been. And they were only robbing small stores most of the time, and so they only had kind of small change. They lived in campsites and out of the car.
The common people, they felt like everything was against them. There was no money, and so when Bonnie and Clyde were robbing banks, it was a chance to strike back at the man in a certain sense.
There's no money in the vault.
Well, he's clearly lying. He's a banker. That's what they do.
Why isn't it locked? Well, like I said, there's a depression on. Banks closing.
It was a time when the public was sort of very anti-government. They were pissed. It was the Depression. People were poor and hungry and losing their jobs. They thought they were stealing from the man. And that was exciting to people. And they were also glamorous and beautiful and young and in love, and no one had ever seen anything like that in America before.
It became a fascination for most of the country, who was going through so many struggles. And I think that for them, once the notoriety started, it was that feeling of that rush that they had, that they needed that. They needed the money to survive. It was a deadly combination.
The number of gangs in a particular location is directly influenced by population density, because at the end of the day, population density points towards congested cities, high numbers of middle and low-class families, and so on. A perfect environment for gangs to form in.
Thank you so much for watching.